You're listening to the Heart Lessons podcast with me, Sarah Rieke. Real women, real stories, real faith. Hi, friend, and thank you for joining me today on the Heart Lessons podcast. My guest on today's episode of Heart Lessons is Kelly Gerken from Sufficient Grace Ministries. Kelly shares about her own experience with infant loss, losing 2 baby daughters to twin transfusion syndrome and a baby son to Potter syndrome. She also talks about the birth of Sufficient Grace Ministries, how it started with her trying to minister to a friend after losing her baby, and then asking herself the question, what would I have wanted someone to give to me? Since then, Sufficient Grace has grown to offer not only these Dreams of You memory books, but also comfort bears, perinatal hospice services, doula services, and even trainings for medical staff to better equip them to support a family walking through infant loss. Kelly's story personifies the character and hope that develops from persevering through a hard time, and she has so much truth to speak about God's daily sufficient grace. Here's my conversation with Kelly. Thank you to everyone who's tuning in today. Here on Heart Lessons, I like to find women who are following the Lord's voice in their lives and walking well in what He has for them. And today I have with me Kelly Gerken from Sufficient Grace Ministries. Hi, Kelly. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
So I would love to just talk about your ministry and what you guys do over at Sufficient Grace. But before we do, would you just tell us a little bit about who you are, about your family, and maybe a little snapshot of what a typical day looks like for you?
Well, I'm a mama. I have 5 babies total. I have 3 that are in heaven and 2 here on earth. And actually, my babies are more like man-children now because they're pretty grown. I have a 23-year-old son that was our firstborn son, Timothy. In between our 2 living children, we had Faith and Grace, who were born still at 26 and a half weeks. They had a condition called twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome, and that's basically where one baby gets too much fluid and blood flow and nourishment from the placenta, and the other baby doesn't get enough. Sometimes that can resolve itself. Sometimes they can do a procedure to help alleviate the symptoms from the issue, but in our case, there wasn't really anything they could do to resolve that for them. And this was in 1996, so that was quite a while ago. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then we had a son after that who was diagnosed with a life-limiting diagnosis in pregnancy. About midway through the pregnancy, we found out that he would not live much past birth, if he would even make it to birth. And he had a condition called Potter syndrome. Usually doctors, when they give you a diagnosis like that, they'll say that your baby is incompatible with life. And so that was the first time that we heard those words. And we found out we were having a son, and we heard that he was incompatible with life. Yeah. Basically, Potter syndrome is where there's no kidneys, and without kidneys, there's low amniotic fluid, and without amniotic fluid, lungs can't develop. So there's really not a chance of survival. And this was in 1998, so our oldest son was 4 at the time. We chose to continue the pregnancy, and usually I tell this story in a flow, so I feel like I'm interrupting myself a little bit. But so we chose to continue the pregnancy, and he was born alive. He lived for 6 hours, full term, about 38 weeks, and just the most precious time in our lives. I guess why don't I just talk about them for a minute?
Yeah, definitely.
While I'm in that. That makes a little more sense.
Sure.
So just kind of backing up with Faith and Grace, we were 21 years old when we found out that there was no heartbeat for our baby girls.
Oh,
and,
wow.
We had kind of had a lot of hope in that pregnancy. Even with that diagnosis, we had hope because I kind of looked at them when they gave me the statistics. They said about 80% of babies with this condition have some issues, or maybe born early, or one or both of the babies could die. And I looked at them with my little 21-year-old self, and I said, well, you can just put those statistics away because I'm a praying mom and these are baby girls and I come from a long line of strong women. So my girls will be just fine. And that was kind of how I coped with that. I just felt like, well, I'm going to pray and it will be okay. Mm-hmm. So when we heard those words, when we heard at 26 and a half weeks along in the pregnancy that our babies didn't have a heartbeat, that moment changed our lives forever. Yeah. It was like being no longer invincible. You know, when you're 21, you're kind of invincible. You can take on the world. But in that moment, we were no longer invincible. Right. In that moment, it didn't happen to someone else. It happened to us. Even though we prayed, even though we knew God, it still happened to us. And so it just felt like my whole world was changed, and our whole world, my husband and I. And I just want to say one other little thing about that moment. A little while later, that, you know, there's the shock of you have to go through labor, and no one knows that that's going to happen. You know, when your baby dies, you're so shocked. Things like that, you never think about what happened. So that's always a surprise often to moms, and that you still have to have labor and you still have to deliver this baby, and there's not going to be a cry and new life filling your arms. And it's just so devastating. But there was this moment when I looked out the window and there were these perfect snowflakes falling from the sky. And, you know, my world is chaos and it's in pieces in that moment. And I'm looking out the window at these perfect snowflakes, and it was kind of like, there's still something beautiful out there. Jesus is still who he says he is. And there's some sort of peace in the middle of my chaos, you know? So that was sort of my focal point for that labor. And when they were born, it was very silent. And I held them one in each arm and sang Amazing Grace. And my husband cried beside me, and my mom was at the foot of the bed, and we said a little prayer, and that was really all I saw of my baby girls. They took some Polaroids in 1996, and they weren't dressed or anything. You know, I didn't know I could do that back then. And when it was time to leave, I told the nurse my arms ached, and she put a cold vase in my hand and wheeled me past the nursery of crying babies. And it was kind of like, this is what the world's going to do with that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's painful.
They don't want to hear about it. You just put on a face and you just hold this instead, you know. And so it was really devastating. I mean, I didn't leave my house for 2 months. I don't know how much you know about me, but I live in a town with about 2,000 people in it, so really small. I went to high school in a cornfield. It's always funny when people come to visit Sufficient Grace because they're not expecting this little town, you know, with no hotels or anything. So anyway, it did really rock our world. There was just a lot of struggle. So then kind of going ahead to where we were talking about Thomas, and I think I did mention I named our baby girls Faith and Grace. Yes. And that was just a special scripture to me in Ephesians, that by grace you are saved through faith and not of works. And that just was a special verse to me. So fast forwarding to Thomas, and just that we have 1 week to make that choice after hearing that diagnosis. Here we are again. Yeah. You know, we've buried 2 babies, and we know what that's like. And we're hearing that our baby is not going to live again. And that's just, it's unheard of to happen once, but to happen again was such a shock. And I remember feeling in that moment, I looked at my husband, and it was kind of like, my husband's name's Tim, it was like the life just drained out of him. Oh. Like if you could just shut off a light switch and everything went dark. And he didn't come back for a long time. It was sort of like shutting down. Mm-hmm. And I felt almost this question over and over, not an audible voice, but just in my head of, where's your God now? Mm. Where's your God now? Yeah. And just so, the feeling was so dark and forsaken. But all I kept saying again in my mind was, well, I don't know, but he has to be here because Jesus says he will never leave us nor forsake us. So he has to be here even in this.
Yeah.
And, that's kind of how I just kept clinging to that as we drove home, and that question again and again. And those feelings of, I think as Christians, we can understand if someone were to come to me and say, man, I'm wondering, what does faith mean? God says we need to have faith to please him. And some of my Christian friends might say, well, you need to believe enough. You can't just pray without belief, or, kind of we say those things.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone were going to come to me, I would say, well, no, God doesn't send these things because of that. He doesn't send these things to teach you a lesson. We can clearly see that on the outside, but when you're in it, in those moments, I remember feeling like, is there some lesson that I didn't learn the first time that this has to happen to us again? And if I would just get this right this time, would God spare my baby?
Yeah, that's so funny you say that, because I had that, I don't know if you know, but we lost 2 babies to similar to what you lost Thomas to.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember thinking the second time, like, God, was there something I was supposed to do the first time that I didn't do, that I have to do again? And that was just so how did you work through that? What was your conclusion?
So it was stormy that day, and you have your tears falling in unison with the raindrops outside. You're kind of there's just water everywhere. It feels like my pain, my tears, the storm. And I grab my Bible and I'm opening it up, and I'm kind of like, all right, look, God, if I need faith to please you, then I need to understand what faith is. Show me. Because I don't get it. What am I not getting? I want to please you. I want to get it. What does it look like? And I was going to read you a little excerpt in my book about that moment. Okay, so I open my Bible, and we had that 1 week to make the decision if we would continue the pregnancy or induce labor early, ending the pregnancy. And this was in 1998. And it was Holy Week. So I was reading quite a bit in the Gospels, but this particular night I wanted to understand faith a little bit. So I had opened my Bible to Hebrews chapter 11. And, okay, I'm going to read a little bit from my book, Sufficient Grace.
Okay.
I wondered, was it enough to think that God could heal our baby, or were we expected to believe with complete confidence that he would heal our baby? That seemed a little preposterous or presumptuous to me. But I wondered about this faith thing. Was my lack of faith the reason for all of this agony? If I could just learn the lesson somehow, would we be spared? These questions plagued me night and day, which prompted me to search the scriptures even more. I wanted to believe. I wanted to trust the Lord completely, but how? What exactly does that mean? It was while wandering in this wilderness that I began to feast on the manna that is straight from heaven, the Word of God. What is faith? Hebrews 11:1 tells us faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. In Hebrews chapter 11, many examples of faith are given. I wondered if the people described in Scripture ever faced doubts or questions in their journey through faithfulness. Abraham, Enoch, Isaac, Noah, Jacob, Moses were mentioned as faithful followers of God. David was called a man after God's own heart. I looked back at the stories of each of these men and some women. None of them were perfect. They only trusted God. There were moments in each of their journeys when circumstances seemed to contradict the truth, and they abided with him anyway. Some of them took matters into their own hands for a moment. Some of them fell for a time. Were they forsaken? Were they no longer useful for the kingdom of God? No. As a matter of fact, somehow these imperfect people are still counted as faithful. They still knew where to turn, even in the moments of doubt. Hebrews 11:10 tells us, without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. I wanted to please God so badly. I wanted to be found faithful and worthy, but how? I believed he existed. I was earnestly seeking him. Was that enough? And so I had read on in my Bible, and this is just me talking a minute. I'm not reading, but just each example those people were a mess.
Yeah.
You know, they didn't know any better than I did if God was really going to keep his promise. You know, when Abraham was told that he was going to have Isaac, he didn't really know for sure. He didn't see the evidence. He had to just believe him. And he even took the matters in his own hands with, you know, his maidservant Hagar, and had Ishmael. And, you know, he and Sarah doubted, and God still used him anyway. Mm-hmm. And, you know, David with his affairs and having, you know, Uriah killed, and just on and on, Noah getting drunk. I realized that all these people were so imperfect, and also that they didn't know. Because sometimes we put that on ourselves. Well, we have to just know he's going to do it. Right. We don't always know how God's going to heal or how he's going to mend or carry us through something. And the other thing that really stuck out to me when I was really seeking in Scripture was the example of Jesus. Because Jesus himself resisted to the point of sweating great drops of blood when he was asking God the Father to take this cup from him before going to the cross. Yeah. And that is not faulted to him that it was hard. He did it for the joy set before him, but it didn't make it any easier. It was hard. Yeah. And that was okay. That I didn't have to skip through it with a false smile, or that I wasn't lacking in faith if I struggled to do what he was asking me to do.
Yeah, I love that. That has given me so much comfort too. And just the fact that Jesus, Jesus said, if this cup could pass from me, please let it. Like, even Jesus was like, yeah, I would really like to not have to do this if at all possible.
Exactly.
So that is huge to me. I take a lot of comfort in that too.
Yeah, because he's our example. And so if he, being our perfect example, felt that way, it was okay. It wasn't a lack of faith on my part that I did not want to do this. Yeah. And that I didn't know how it would feel or if I could endure it. So I wrote, this is back to in my book again, in page 82. Faith begins with where our eyes are looking and who our hearts are trusting. God had a plan and a purpose for us. God was and is able to carry us through, but even more, he would reveal glory in us. He would use our pain and suffering to reveal and glorify himself, and he would somehow heal and restore us. Maybe faith was partly accepting whatever he gives and believing him whatever happens. It's less about our circumstances and our performance and more about who he is and what he's able to do through us if we seek and obey him. Through his word, we learn that faith goes hand in hand with obedience. God uses the struggle we face. He uses our pain to draw us to him and to complete the good work he starts in us. He grows us and establishes us, teaching us to abide in him. He never wastes anything in our lives, not the pain, not the sorrow, not the joy, not even our own weaknesses, failures, victories, and sins. I wanted to know what Jesus would do. I wanted to look to him to my example. And so I asked him, Lord, show yourself to me. Teach me how to be faithful. Give me strength. And he did, day by day and verse by verse. One of the most powerful moments when I was looking in his word was how we named Thomas, actually. Because I believe the whole journey, it was 4.5 months from the time we received the diagnosis to when we had Thomas. It was 4.5 months. And I believe that was our journey of learning to believe without seeing. Because we hear of Thomas being the one when Jesus is risen from the dead. And he's the one that says, I want to see those holes in your hands. Yeah. And I need to see it to believe it. And Jesus says, Thomas, you believe because you see, but blessed are those who believe without seeing. And I just feel like that whole journey, I know it was for us so much about trusting him when we don't get the answer, when we don't get to see this side of heaven, believing that there are still miracles, even if they aren't the kind that we expect. And learning that it isn't about us. It isn't about how we perform or how well we believe. It's about how big our God is and what he's able to do. Because as you know, so many times we hear about people praising God because they get the miracle this side of heaven.
Right.
And that makes us, and they say, well, it was because I prayed. but what does that say about my prayer and your prayer?
Yeah.
What does that say? You know? And so those were those hard questions. And it's all wrapped up in a neat bow when I'm telling it now, but it's not like that. It's like this ugly, stumbling, gritty, holding on for your next breath kind of clinging,
Yeah.
And it's messy and hard and it hurts. When we did choose then to continue the pregnancy, and it's important to me to share, as much as I love the gift and sanctity of life, I wasn't one that knew for sure what to do.
Yeah.
I did agonize over that decision, because there was a part of me that felt like I asked those hard questions that everyone, that I think a lot of people do, of, well, if I could just get this over with, would it spare my family the pain? I knew what it was like to stand over that grave once. Maybe I could just make this easier somehow, or would it hurt my baby to carry him without amniotic fluid? There's scary things they describe, that could happen. And so I asked those really hard questions, and I think it's important to say that, because so many times I feel like we're really hard on people if they made a different choice in that moment, and it's a really tough place to be when you love your baby. So I just want to be real that I didn't just skip through that decision easily. I'm really glad that I had that time, and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. But I do get that struggle for mamas, and we need to give love and grace when a mom's trying to decide something so impossible.
Yeah, and there's so many factors. Fear is so huge, in that moment, and that can be a major motivator in your decision making.
Sure.
So you can't really fault somebody for being fearful.
No, it's very hard.
Yeah, it's very hard and scary, and
yeah. So when I was waiting to meet Thomas, I had this really great friend named Dinah, and I write about her a lot when I share our story. But I would ask her, how am I going to do this again? How am I going to bury another child? How will I get through this? And she would say, I can see God's grace on you, and when you get to the end of this journey, His grace will be sufficient for you. Mm-hmm. And we don't get the grace that we need tomorrow. Today, we only get enough to get through today. And that is such a powerful thing, that knowledge of His sufficient grace that, Scripture talks about in 2 Corinthians 12:9. That's what we get. And that was not only a worthy sentiment for that moment, but for every moment in grief and every moment since then. It's been it's such a powerful thing. I say it again and again to families, even now, is you only get enough to get through right now, but it is enough.
Yeah.
And isn't that the key, to getting through it? Really, is just one step, one breath at a time. So very much I was carried through that. And when Thomas was born, we were able to hold him when it was time for him to pass away. When he was hooked up to machines. We didn't know about comfort care back in 1998. So when I met him, he was in the NICU, all hooked up to machines that breathed for him and blinked and beeped and made all the sounds.
Yeah.
And I remember just thinking, I kissed him, I told him he wasn't alone and that I loved him. And I wasn't there long before his lung collapsed again. I realized immediately there was just a crazy peace that surpasses all human understanding there. And I knew right away that when it was time to say goodbye, that I would be okay. That I understood that what was waiting for him was better for him than what he was enduring in that moment. And so I understood that. And when I was able to be with him then and rock him and sing to him as he went from my arms to the arms of Jesus, those moments were just the most amazing moments of my life. I would do those 4.5 months again and again to just be with him in those moments. And I had my answer to that question, where's your God now? Because he was right there. He was right there. I felt the presence of Jesus with us in that room, so close, as if could touch him, you know, and just that comfort and that peace and that grace was there.
I think I can echo the feelings of like almost palpably feeling God's presence in those kind of holy moments. Like, I don't know, and you have to think the babies are a breath away from heaven, and like God's presence just felt like it was right there.
Yeah.
So I agree with that.
That place where heaven meets earth.
Yes.
It feels like that's the closest we get this side of heaven to him, you know. So yeah, it's amazing. So those moments were just precious, and we did have another pregnancy after Thomas that was unexpected, and that's our son James, who's now 15. We had a lot of complications. He had a subchorionic hematoma, and we had about a 50% chance at one point of not, you know, possibly miscarrying or delivering him premature. And he was born healthy and well, and is very ornery and full of life. So, yeah. So Sufficient Grace Ministries, we didn't start right away. We were kind of just trying to survive. I know a lot of people start a mission right away or something to just find that purpose from the pain, or to kind of pour to mother and parent and, you know, pour their hearts into. And it's so awesome when we see that, but I just wasn't that person. And, you know, once James was born, I was very much into going to the Little League games for Timothy and, you know, taking care of my baby and staying married. Those were my goals.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until 2004, a friend of mine had lost her baby in 2003. And from, you know, 1998 to 2003, 2004, I really stayed away from pregnancy in general, or pregnancy and infant loss, definitely. It was sort of nothing I wanted to revisit. It was kind of a traumatic, difficult place that I didn't want to go. And so I just wanted to get through life, and I wasn't looking there. But when her baby died, it was sort of like waking up.
Yeah.
And I wanted to give her a memory book, and I couldn't find anything that was nice enough to say a treasured life had been here. And so that kind of led to developing the Dreams of You memory book. And like I said, it was like waking up. It was those first time I even said, what would I have wanted? Something to give me. What would have been a comfort? What would have meant something to me if someone had given me something?
Right.
And so that's the Dreams of You memory book, and that was the first thing that we did. And it's basically like a baby book for a baby whose life is brief. Because, you know, if you go get a regular baby book, you're just going to see even more of what you're missing.
Yeah.
And so this is for a brief life, to honor that life. And there's poems and scripture and a place to write about your baby and put footprints and handprints if you have the book ahead of time. So it's just a special book. And then my mom created the comfort bears that we give to families. And she sewed the first comfort bears up until 2006 when she passed away from cancer. And so now we have grandmas that sew the bears. And we actually have teams of children, students, stuff the bears. So we have some after-school programs for at-risk youth and just some youth that are in these programs. We've been to camps for children whose parents are incarcerated, and just some different programs where the students will stuff a comfort bear, and they'll write a little message to a family, and they'll also learn about healthy ways to grieve, and they get to talk about their own grief if they've had a loss in their family in a safe place. Yeah. And so that's a really cool thing that kind of spurred out of our little bears. I always laugh. I wrote these books, and we get really the most letters about our comfort bears.
That's great, though. It's great that it's like a community effort, and you can, you know, positively influence so many people through it, not just the receivers of the bears, but also those making it. That's pretty cool. That's awesome.
It's kind of like God, you know. He just multiplies things.
Yeah. Because
he didn't really think of that. That was just something he's sort of done. And we started online. We started sending. We became a 501c3 nonprofit right away. Started sending our packages, our bear and our book, to families. And we would get pictures of people holding the bear, or, siblings with the bear. And we would hear stories and from the parents of their experiences. And in 2006, we started doing some hospital training to talk to hospital staff about compassionate care and resources for families, because we were hearing that there was just kind of a gap where families weren't always getting resources or time with their baby, or they didn't know they could do some things. And so we wanted to provide some hospital education. So we started to do that. And in 2011, we started to research quite a bit about perinatal hospice. And for anyone listening that's unaware of what perinatal hospice is, it's another word for it is hospice in the womb. And it's basically for families like ours who received a life-limiting diagnosis in pregnancy, and their baby's life was expected to be brief, and they were met with that option of, do we continue this pregnancy or not? And they've chosen to continue that pregnancy. And so perinatal hospice is a way of supporting those families and walking that journey with those families and providing resources and making birth plans. And what we were finding is, even with our hospital education, maybe only one or two nurses was comfortable providing that kind of support, which is understandable. I mean, we're just, maybe they didn't become an OB nurse to do this, to take care of loss, and that's okay.
That's a hard part of their job. They're used to welcoming life in the world, and then when it's not that way, it can be uncomfortable, I can imagine.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard when you're used to, their job is to make people well, and like you said, to bring life into the world. And so it's devastating for everyone. And so there's some amazing nurses out there. And I've never met a nurse that didn't want to be compassionate and help her patients. That's why they're nurses. So they're amazing. But what we were finding is several things. There's not a lot of education on support through loss provided when you're being trained to be a nurse or medical professional. What is taught is sometimes clinical or more like a checklist. And then there's that third thing is not everyone's comfortable, even if the skills and resources are available, not everyone's comfortable. And so there were patients still not getting those resources. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to learn, how can we bridge that gap and provide some of those resources and make sure families. So the first time I thought of it was in 2006. I talked at a grand rounds at Good Samaritan Hospital, and I mentioned the idea of, what if we paired a family who's gone through loss with another parent who's been through loss and can make sure that they have those things,
Yeah. Sort of parent, helping from experience. I've been here, let me help you through.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
exactly. Cool. And they could be with them through the whole journey, and not just, nurses, even if you have a wonderful nurse helping you, her shift ends, and so so maybe that parent could be with you as you plan. They could answer questions. Maybe they could even be trained to go and provide support. So we started to learn about perinatal hospice, and we met with a place called the Haven Network outside of Chicago in Rockford, Illinois. And I walked in, and I remember just after a few minutes, I started weeping, and the one of the ladies I was meeting with there said, I know it's hard to see these pictures, this can be emotional. I said, oh no, it's not that. I'm seeing what I have envisioned and dreamed, and you're doing some of it.
That's wonderful.
So it was so cool and so inspiring, because what they had done is they partnered support people with remembrance photographers to go and provide the support and be there for these families. And so we had some pieces of that puzzle that they hadn't been doing, and they had some pieces of the puzzle that we hadn't been doing, and we just collaborated, and it was just so cool to find someone whose hearts were knit with ours, and we learned a lot from them, and vice versa, I think. And so we've kind of had a relationship with them. And then we learned about Stillbirth Day, and we became birth and bereavement doulas. And a doula is basically a support person in labor. And this is specifically a support person who's trained to support in labor, but can support specifically for loss in any gestation. And so we wanted to have some professional background behind just our own experience and the trainings that we were writing. We wanted to have even more education so that we had some credibility walking into the hospitals.
Yeah.
We weren't just some mama,
Right,
coming
right.
in. And we began to talk to our area hospitals. So we're located in Ohio. And at first we had a couple smaller hospitals, and then pretty soon we now have branches in Northwest, every region in Ohio, actually.
Okay.
Excuse me. So in Cleveland area, in Northwest Ohio, where I am, the Toledo area, Cincinnati, Dayton area, Southwest Ohio, Southeast Ohio, and then Central Ohio, where Columbus is. So we have some people in each of those branches that can provide support. And we go, you asked me earlier what a day is like for me.
Yeah.
And so fast forwarding to today, we've now sent, I think at one point it was 4,000 or 5,000 packages all over the world. So so every week we send Dreams of You packages to families all over the world and provide support online. Usually about once a week I speak somewhere and share our story and our ministry at a church or a women's event to kind of help raise support for what we're doing, because we don't charge families for any of what we provide.
Yeah.
And then in any given moment, I could be called to the hospital. It could be 2 a.m. It could be in the middle of my son's baseball game. It can be any time. And so any of us that are in these branches that serve as support companions or doulas and remembrance photographers, we'll get a hold of a partner to come with us. If we get that hospital call, and we'll pack our bag with clothes to fit those babies. We have volunteers that make clothing for babies in all sizes and little bracelets for moms and babies. Any tangible memory that we can give and any tangible item that says this baby matters, your baby matters, your experience matters, your story matters, and we're here to help you honor that baby. And so we go and we're just with that family. We may provide support for their whole labor if they want, and not everyone does, but some do. And then we will help them make memories. We like to include the parents, so it's a little different than maybe some philosophies that you might hear. We like to include the parents in everything. If they want to help bathe their baby, we will bring things by the bedside so they can help take part in all of that, because no one is more equipped to parent a baby than his or her parents.
Yeah.
And whether that baby's alive or not. And so we want to be there to take that fear away, and then they can embrace that time with their baby. And we're just kind of there to facilitate that. So many parents, I know myself, I wouldn't have known, and I didn't know that I could do certain things. So just even having someone there to say, would you like to bathe your baby? Takes away that fear and says it's okay if you do. Or would you like some professional pictures of your baby? And I know this might feel overwhelming and scary, and you might think, what? People do that? Because who thinks about what would you do if your baby died? Nobody.
Right, yeah.
But
nobody wants to.
Yeah. But as a mom who's been there, I can tell you, you're going to want this later. So to just have that person there makes the difference between, you're going to feel the pain and grief no matter what, but it can take away some of those regrets of, I could have done this and I didn't know. So that's our job, is we're kind of there to walk alongside these families as companions through that experience and make sure they have everything that they may want for that time. Sometimes we're with families who are perinatal hospice families who receive that diagnosis, and we can help them months in advance making a birth plan, help them going to appointments, help them along the way as they run into different obstacles or concerns and questions, and we help find resources if we don't have something already for them. We might help them planning their memorial service. So we're not just there even just at the hospital, but sometimes that relationship is months before and months after, and some of our families have been with us for a couple years after.
Yeah.
We also have support groups in person and online, so I do lots of those things. And I did write a book. In addition to the resources we've written for fathers and families, the smaller booklets that we have, I wrote a book called Sufficient Grace that tells my story. So We also provide a lot of training. We still do our hospital trainings, but we do it a little differently. We now talk about establishing a perinatal loss support program and using the idea of companioning families. And so we not only do that throughout Ohio, but I travel places to train as well. So
Okay. I was actually going to ask if you had plans on expanding outside of Ohio.
So right now, the way that we have it set up is because we're very particular about who we would send into a hospital. It's really been hard for us to decide what to do with that. But two missions are on our hearts for Sufficient Grace. And so we always, whenever we look at a decision like that, we say, does it meet these missions? And the first is, we're based on the scripture in 2 Corinthians 1, 3, and 4, which talks about comforting others with the comfort we receive from God. And so we look at two things. Is whatever's in front of us, is it going to help support a family? Is it going to provide comfort for a family going through grief? Or is it going to equip someone to provide comfort for a family going through grief? So that's why training does fall in there for us, is we can give those tools. And so through a lot of prayer, we kind of decided that it's important to us to keep a lot of things in Ohio because I can physically drive there and make sure everything's going okay and meet with people. And, we can kind of do that. But
yeah, you can keep tabs on everybody pretty closely.
Sure. And that was awesome, but we also didn't want to keep these tools. That this beautiful program is so different, because you might find a program out there that has one component or two components or some part of this, but to have such a comprehensive program that's providing not only all the resources, but the support person and the photography and just kind of everything for the family, it's not out there very much. And the idea of really walking with a family and entering in with them it's kind of unique. Yeah. So we don't want to keep that just in Ohio. So we've been traveling. We've trained in Pennsylvania and Kentucky and Oklahoma already. And next month I'll be in Nebraska. I think there's plans for South Dakota and going to Oklahoma again soon. And so we are open now to going to what we will allow people to do is to be an affiliate, and we'll provide them with our training on how do you do this, but we won't have to be responsible for them. So it's basically, we're going to teach you, we're going to give you these tools and teach you how to establish this program, and we're here to support you from a distance, but Sufficient Grace isn't necessarily completely overseeing your operations. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that's what we are open to doing now. And so, yeah. And honestly, just to throw in, we talked about how being with our babies like that was like standing in the place where heaven meets earth. And the first time that I ever supported a family, I remember it, and it's still, right before we walk in the room, you don't know. You feel like you're entering sacred ground for sure.
Yeah.
And you don't know how you'll be received. And you feel so inadequate and small. And we always pray before we walk in because we know we are inadequate. We know that there is nothing that we could give them or say to them to take away this mountain of pain and make it better. We know it as we stand there. And so we pray and ask that we would be vessels of God's love, and that He would show us how to support that family. And the first time before I walked in, Holly, who's our vice president, looked at me and said, they wanted to know what it's like to watch your baby die. Mm. And I remember that moment. I thought, I know how to answer that. I can answer that one question. And just like that grace is, we get one little nugget of grace at a time, one breath at a time. It's one question at a time.
Yeah.
It's one, I'm going to just sit with you in this and be present with you in this, wherever that looks like, wherever you are in this. And what I have learned is that first time, I didn't expect to feel what I felt. I never entered into Sufficient Grace in order to make a legacy for my babies, even though I do I do understand now that it's because they lived that I do this, but I didn't do it for that purpose. I didn't do it in that way because it was so many years after. I wasn't really looking for that. I just really wanted to fill the need. But in so many ways, God always gives us a gift above what we're asking for. He always does that. Because as I was sitting there, and whenever I'm with a family, it's about them. It's not about me. But that very first family, as I put the bracelet onto that tiny little baby girl hand, I had this moment where I felt heaven meeting earth again. And it felt like I was able to be doing that for my baby girl, for all the baby girls. and it just was this incredible moment when I came home. My husband, because we're one flesh, so even though he's not physically there, he's there. He knows where I'm at.
Yeah.
And he looks at me and he says, "How was it?" And I said, "It was like seeing our children for the first time in 16 years. It was like being in that place again where heaven meets earth. And Jesus is so close." And of course, we're both just crying, and it's the middle of the night. But it was incredible. And you don't ever serve the Lord for yourself because there's so much sacrifice in it. I mean, that's only going to get you so far anyway.
Right.
Those feel-good moments. Because when you haven't slept for 60 hours and you're on your third straight family and you're beyond, there's a nitty-gritty to serving. It cannot be selfish. It cannot. But there are gifts in it that are so beautiful. And so it is, that heaven meets earth thing is there for every family. And what has struck me is the love of Jesus fills the room for every family. Not even if just as much the heroin addict or the prostitute or a person who's maybe not set foot in church in a while as the Sunday churchgoer, the love of Jesus is still in that room for them, even if the family doesn't feel it necessarily. And that's really been humbling to me. And it's taught me a lot more than I understood before about who he is, how much he just loves us all, and how we're all really so the same. We're all there in need of that love and all broken. And that there's such an equalizer in that. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, to Jesus, every life is precious. To the Lord, every life is precious. So whether or not the family is committed to being, to living in a Christian way, that little life is going to heaven, and the Lord is right there with that precious life that He created. So, yeah.
And He loves that life, and every life is worthy of being celebrated and honored. And He also wants the people to know that He loves them. The hurting people right there, saying goodbye to that baby. And so to just quietly be vessels of that love, I mean, we don't necessarily broadcast, we're doing this, because as vessels of Jesus,
right.
We're just there loving them. But it's a really sacred privilege. And just serving in general is something that's really struck me, is how there is a mountain of need.
Yeah.
And none of us, not one of us could ever fill it, no matter if we poured ourselves out 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we don't have to be enough, though, because Jesus is enough. But when He breaks your heart for people, when He calls you to enter into that, you can't leave it. And it is part of your every moment. And it is not at all what I expected.
Yeah.
And I love it. It's beautiful and amazing, but there's so much brokenness and so much of our own just weakness and need for Him in it. There's so little glory for us, and that's a good thing because it's Him, and it's a very humbling thing entering in to serve other people that way.
That makes me. Are you familiar with Katie Davis or her story at all? Kisses for
No.
Katie was the book that she wrote. She's a girl, I don't know, maybe late 20s, who started a ministry in Uganda, and she, takes care of not necessarily orphans, but just, kids that are just living in the slums and they don't have food. And so she basically started a school and she cares for them. And she said, sometimes it feels like I'm trying to drain the ocean one eyedropper full at a time.
Yes.
Because the need is so great, and, all she can do. But she's like, that's all I can do is take care. Today I'm going to take care of this one child and meet this one child's need and just trust that that's what God had for me today.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And that's what we talk about. Just, I can't help every single person, but I can love the one in front of me.
Yeah.
And that's what we do. We can give what we have to give to the one in front of us.
As you are walking on this road God has for you in this ministry that you've started, what is something that He keeps whispering to your heart that keeps you going along this road? A heart lesson that you'd say He keeps telling this to me so I can just keep going on.
Definitely the sufficient grace is such a message I go back to again and again because it covers so much. Because I think for me, I wrestle with being enough for this calling. Am I enough? Do I have enough? Is my offering worthy enough? And the answer will always be no, it can never be enough. But that it isn't about my enough, that he answers my not enough with plenty, and that's His sufficient grace, that it will always be sufficient. And that's for everything. It's for the ability to serve. It's for having enough love. It's for having enough energy to do the next thing. His sufficient grace is enough to provide for us, not just spiritually and emotionally and physically, but even in our needs, our resource needs. And His sufficient grace is enough to help me lead when we have these beautiful women who've chosen to serve in this way alongside me. So I think I would definitely say that he brings me back to that often.
Yeah. Well, Kelly, this has been such a great conversation. I am so thankful that you said yes to be on this podcast, and I can't wait for people to hear about your ministry. And if someone's interested in supporting Sufficient Grace, how can we find out about it, and how can we support your ministry?
So there's a lot of information on our website, sufficientgraceministries.org, and we have a Support Sufficient Grace button or donate button. I'm not sure. We just redid it, so I'm not sure exactly what it says. But if you go to the donate page or Support Sufficient Grace page, you'll find a donate button if you want to donate online. There's also an address where people can mail a check, and we also have a list of some needs if you'd rather give in a different way. So those are some options there. We also have volunteer needs, and you can read all about that on our website. Our website's a pretty good spot to go, and you can connect with us on Facebook as well.
Well, great. Thank you so much again, and I pray all God's best on your ministry. It's pretty wonderful, so thank you.
Thank you so much.
Having walked the road of caring to term a baby with a fatal diagnosis, 2 babies actually, Kelly's ministry is very near and dear to my heart. I love that she is meeting a need for these families, not only as they grieve, but also as they experience that holy intersection of heaven and earth. I loved Kelly's words on God's daily sufficient grace and the fact that God will give us what we need in that moment, that day, to reach that person. Anxiety and worry come when we start to think past that daily sufficient grace, but God is always faithful to give us that manna every day. It's so hard to remember, especially when we feel so inadequate, but it's such an important truth to hide in our hearts. For more info on Sufficient Grace Ministries and the services they provide, or if you're interested in supporting them financially or otherwise, visit sufficientgraceministries.org. You can also visit my blog at sarahrieke.com for show notes on this episode and links to find out more about Kelly and her wonderful ministry. So this was episode 20 of Heart Lessons. I can't believe we've done this 20 times. It feels kind of crazy, but thank you for being here and continuing to listen and support this podcast. And I will definitely accept all the virtual high fives and hugs you want to give me. Thanks again for tuning in to Heart Lessons, and as always, I hope you were able to come away with a heart lesson of your own to help you draw closer to the Lord.